I want to talk about consequentialism again and give us a sense of how we really think through a problem from a utilitarian point of view. Bentham and Mill are giving us a view that some philosophers think of as unsophisticated. In fact, some think that really Western ethics has been a decline ever since Plato and Aristotle to the utter wasteland of Bentham and Mill. But others feel very differently about it. Iris Murdoch, a British philosopher and novelist, said that one reads Bentham and Mill with this sense of fresh air, that these are talking about real people with real problems, unlike a lot of philosophers who discuss problems of ethics in a sort of otherworldly way, especially in the 20th century. So you look back at them and you think, well, yes, they're talking about people who want to be happy, who experience pleasure, who experience pain, who think pleasure's good, pain's bad, and they want human life to be as good as possible. So let's return to the principle we were talking about last time, the principle of utility. As we saw, as they construe it, it's really a comparative principle. It's not giving you a criterion of right and wrong. It's not really telling you directly what you ought to do. Instead, it's ranking things like this as better and worse. Something is right in proportion to its tendency to promote happiness. And so one thing we can ask is, well, do we get any sense of ought or must out of this at all? Or maybe we just get better than. What's the relationship between better than and any sense of obligation? Well, it's a tricky question. When Bentham considers this, he says, well, and by the way, I should explain something about Bentham. He is the kind of writer that's sort of how can I put it, an acquired taste. He wrote for much of his life, he wrote volume after volume. They are now editing his works finally to try to get all of them published. They've never all been published. They expect that by the end there will be more than 80 volumes of Bentham's work. He wrote in a shorthand that he invented himself so that he could write faster, and there are only a few people in the world who can even read it. In any case, here is the beginning of the introduction to the principles of morals and legislation. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, notice ought, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong, and here it looks like he's talking about a standard of right and wrong, right? So it looks like we can't just rest content with better and worse. He wants something more than that. But on the other hand, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. In words, a man may pretend to abjure their empire, but in reality he will remain subject to it all the while. The principle of utility recognizes this subjection and assumes it for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and of law. Systems which attempt to question it deal in sounds instead of sense, in caprice instead of reason, in darkness instead of light. But enough of metaphor and declamation. It is not by such means that moral science is to be improved. So he can write very dramatically, but he most of the time purposely chooses not to. He thinks that will just mislead you. Now, when he returns to this question of the standard of right and wrong, of what you ought to do, he ends up saying, well, an action may be said to be conformable to the principle of utility when the tendency it has to augment the happiness of the community is greater than any it has to diminish it. And then he says, of such an action, one may always say that it's one that ought to be done, or at least that it's not one that ought not to be done. That it's right that it should be done, or at least that it's not wrong that it should be done. That it's a right action, or at least it's not a wrong action. Now think about what he's saying here. He's basically saying, look, at some point here is some 0 point, right? That is to say, above this, the overall tendency of the action to promote utility is greater than any it has to diminish it. Below this, the net effect is against happiness. Okay, it's toward unhappiness. Now, of course, lots of actions promote some happiness for some people, some unhappiness for other people. Maybe even the same person is made happy in one respect and not in another. So all of this has to be taken into account, and we look at the balance, and we say is above 0 or below 0. Now, at first glance, he says, well, if it's above 0, we say you ought to do it. But that's obviously not going to work. Why not? Yeah. Exactly, a lot of things fall above 0. So you think, man, I'm hungry. After this class, I'm going to get food. And you think, what should I eat? Well, it's not like there's only one thing in the universe that's going to make you happy, right? If you eat it for lunch. There might be lots of things. You could think, ooh, I could have a taco. Ah, I could have a burrito. Ooh, I could have one of those little Zen rice bowls. Ah, I could have, I'm just trying to think of the various restaurants very close to here, Chick-fil-A, or I could go to Starbucks and get one of those little pastries, or, you could think all those things. It's like, oh, they would all be good, okay? Or maybe you think, oh, actually none of that food is really very yummy. I have to walk a long way to get something I really like. So actually all of those are negative. But anyway, let's suppose a bunch of them are positive. There are lots of things you could have for lunch that would make you happy, on balance. Well then, which should you do? It's absurd to say you ought to do them all, right? Yeah, you ought to eat Chick-fil-A and get a rice bowl and eat a taco and eat a burrito. No. So that doesn't make any sense. So he says, well, okay, we could say at least they're all permissible, right? They're all okay. At least it's the case that they ought not to be done, which you might say is to say they're all morally acceptable actions. So it looks as if Bentham is saying, really, we have to be in this range. We have to be better than 0. We've got to be trying to make a net positive contribution. He's not saying we have to choose the best of all of those. Now, you could think we have to choose the best. Suppose here are the various options we've got, and they're ranked that way. Well, then, what should we do? One interpretation is, and it seems to be what Bentham is saying, do whatever you want. But there's another natural attitude to have about that. Suppose you do have this option. You're like, yeah, I'd like a taco. Ooh, those Zen bowls, that's even better. Ah, but this other thing, that's even better. Now, which should you choose? Yeah.
Well, like in economics, there's like a marginal utility over price function. So like say like Chick-fil-A is the best to you, but like there might be a long line, Chick-fil-A always has a line, where there's like a price component, like you might like prefer Chick-fil-A, but you're willing to eat a taco because it's $1 cheaper and you don't have to wait in line.
Ah, good. So yeah, as a matter of fact, when I go over there, I always get Taco Cabana. And it's just because it's the shortest line and it's the cheapest, okay? So you're right. It's not just the quality of the food. It's really the whole thing, right? We have to consider the costs as well as the benefits. And the costs can include the money you spend on getting this, the time it takes to go through the line, how likely it is they're going to actually get the order right. Over there, they're very good at that. But I know of some restaurants where it's a total dice throw. You order these things and it may or may not turn out what you wanted. But luckily, I don't care all that much. But still, so all that has to be taken into account. You have to think about all the potential benefits, but all the potential harms too. Yeah?
It could also be possible that no matter the line, it's more expensive, all that, you say, I still don't care, I want the Chick-fil-A, it's that much better to me.
Right, okay. So suppose we think of this as what you get if you add together the quality of the food and the price and the length of the line and all of that. All the considerations get combined and you say, this. Well, Bentham seems to be saying, choose whatever you want. It's not a moral decision, okay? Any of those are enough. That sort of view is called a satisficing view. That is to say, you have to do enough. But now, you don't have to choose the best one. It's up to you. In the case of thinking about what to have for lunch, you can easily say, yeah, I don't see that it's a moral decision. In other cases, what is he saying? Well, when this is more morally dramatic, you might say, and makes more of a difference to other people, you can think, well, he's in effect saying, look, you have to do something that benefits. You have to make the situation better. But on the other hand, you don't have to choose the maximal thing. So it gives you the flexibility to choose something that's good enough, even if it's not the best you can do. On the other hand, there's another way of looking at this to say, well, actually, I think, why aren't you doing this one? If it's the best one, do it, right? So that would be another way of taking this. That would be to say, you've got to maximize. Choose the best. And those are two different interpretations of utilitarianism. Bentham and Mill, I think, sort of flop between the two of them. Bentham, when he's stating things officially, articulates this view. But sometimes he's happy to summarize his view as the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And greatest suggests maximum, right? So really, he seems not to notice the difference. And in fact, the way he phrases this, you ought to do it, or at least it's not the case that you ought not to do it. I think he sees that there's a difference, and he doesn't know what to say about it. So he waffles back and forth and says something confusing. But that's really, there's really a divide here. There are two different ways of taking it. Now, one thing that makes it make a real difference is when we think about the difference between ought and must. If I ask what I should do, what I ought to do, is that any different from asking what I have to do, what I must do? It feels like it is, right? Give an example of that. Where would you say, well, okay, you've got to do this, right? You must do that. You ought to do this, but you don't really have to. Yeah?
I should get ahead on my assignments because I'm going to have a busy week, or I have to tonight because there's a deadline.
Okay, good, good. You might think, this is due tomorrow, so I have to do it tonight. I must do it tonight. Or you could think, oh, it's due from a week from now. I should start on it now, but I don't have to, right? That's a recipe for procrastination. I know it well. I'm writing this book, and, we academics are famous for this. Oh, so how much have you got? One chapter. How much did you have by the end of last summer? Oh, one chapter. But I'm still writing it. I'm writing it up here. I think about it once or twice a week for 5 minutes. In any event, that's the sort of thing that you can say, yeah, that's a good example. So if that's right, you might say, look, you ought to maximize. You must do enough. And that would be a nice way of giving some indication of the difference. If we really have this view, then we'd have to say, well, gosh, you just always must do the maximum. You always must do your best. But this would allow you to say, well, you ought to do your best. You have to do at least enough. Yeah.
I think there's a way to integrate at least the good example and project that into the maximizing. Like you would say the difference, like if you look at Chick-fil-A versus Taco Bell and all of that, like maybe like the time you would spend choosing it is like the cost that would ultimately make that decision less.
Ooh. All right, good, good, good. Yes, the decision itself takes some time. And so this is one of the things that's going to become tricky as we think through this theory. Because Bentham and Mill will give us a method for trying to solve moral problems. And it's a method that in simple cases doesn't require much, but in complicated cases requires a lot. Now you might think, well, wait a minute. Just going through this process itself is a cost. Imagine you're with a friend who's a committed utilitarian and thinks, I've got to do a calculation before I do this. So, let's say we have these three options. Well, I have to compute. What is the length of the line? How much does it cost? Just how much do I like this? What are the odds that they'll mess up my order? Blah, blah, blah. And in short, you think, well, look, we have 45 minutes to eat. You just took 40 of them deciding which one to go to. And look, I mean, in personal life, there is a way of the person just keeping, I need more information, right? Let's say, my camera broke. I'm trying to get a new camera. But that'll take them months because they have to research every possible camera, talk to everybody about which cameras they like and don't like and so on. It will take forever. Or it's a serious problem in government. Government will say, we got a serious problem. Let's appoint a committee. The committee studies it. 3 years later, they produce a report, and it recommends that there be a new committee, et cetera. Yeah.
How do you judge which action is more positive? Like, what if one action makes 50 people really happy and another one makes 100 people kind of happy?
Good. How do we tell? Now, that brings us to the moral calculus. This is how we figure it out. Yes?
Doesn't this kind of assume that we know, like, different levels of happy? Because, like, there are times when I'm like, oh, I'm happy, but, like, another thing, I don't even know, or, like, I don't even know what the levels of happiness are, or if I'm actually happy, or, like, how to define it. So,
Ah.
it assumes that there's, like, a standard, like, almost like unit, like meters for happiness, and everyone knows it, and everyone, like, is aware of all things.
Yes. Okay, good. This is one major issue that we had to address, but there is another one, because after all, an act is right in proportion to its tendency to promote happiness. So you can say, wait, first of all, what is that? Secondly, how do I know, right? What's going to promote happiness? How do I have the ability to identify happiness when I even see it? Now, Mill and Bentham give the same answer. Remember that in Aristotle, the answer is this big, expansive thing. It's living well, it's thriving, it's flourishing. And if you think, how do I measure that and tell whether I flourish more here or here? It's like, oh, I don't know. But here they say, oh, look, it's not that complicated. It's simply pleasure and the absence of pain. That's happiness. Well, if you think of it that way, it feels like, okay, maybe I can compute amounts of pleasure and pain more easily than I can compute other things. But both of those are tricky. And notice, I've got to be able to put them on the same scale. So there's several different issues that are going to emerge as we do this here. And one of the issues that I think you've identified, I'll just call it the transparency. Forget knowing whether you're happy or not. Do I even know if I'm happy or not? Right now, just reflect on your own state. To imagine that you have a little meter attached to you that measures levels of pleasure and levels of pain, okay? How much pleasure are you feeling right now? How much pain? Normally, I'm not aware of pain, you know. On the other hand, I was in a car accident a few years ago, and shortly after that, I was supervising somebody's master's thesis on the phenomenology of pain. She would come to my office once a week and talk for about 2 hours about pain and what it's like to feel pain and the neurophysiology of that and all of that. And at the beginning of our meetings, and she was a good student, it was really interesting. But at the beginning of those meetings, I would feel fine. And sitting there, I'd start realizing, oh, my back does kind of hurt. You know, and, oh, my neck is so stiff. And by the end of those meetings, it was like, oh, I'm in a lot of pain. And if we hadn't been discussing pain, I wouldn't have been aware of it at all. Right? You're young, so you don't perhaps know what I'm talking about. But when you get to my age, you'll think, oh yeah, I know exactly what you mean. You don't feel like you're in pain until you stop and think about it. It's like, oh yeah, kind of. There's this low-level thing. And the same is true with pleasure, right? You can be there and things are fine. But then I say, are you experiencing pleasure today? Well, you think, I don't know. I've got this nice, it's a warm day. It feels good. And, blah, blah, blah. In short, anyway, are we even aware of our own? Yeah.
I think, isn't this assuming that measuring the pleasure and absence of pain is reliably measuring, like, what it means to live well? But then can't you question that as well?
Oh, sure. I mean, is this really equal to that? Is that what happiness really is? You might think right now, in a typical sort of state, sitting in a classroom, you're not feeling much pleasure, you're not feeling much pain. I mean, it's not horribly boring, but it's not really thrilling either. And so you're sitting there, it's kind of like you're just hovering right around zero. Okay? Now, does that mean your happiness level is just Not really, right? Maybe lots of things are going well in your life. And if I say, hey, are you happy these days? So, yeah. Or maybe things are going badly in your life. Doesn't mean you're feeling any pleasure or pain right now. But you say, yeah, actually things kind of stink. I'm pretty unhappy about blah, 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 blah. So yes, I mean, there is a huge issue about whether we can really make this identification. Aristotle would be appalled. Thomas Carlyle and other critics of utilitarianism were appalled. In fact, Mill talks about this objection. Carlyle and he write a series of letters back and forth in the 1830s where Carlyle says, look, this is a philosophy fit for pigs. I mean, pigs just care about pleasure and pain. There they are in their little pen slopping around. Yeah, if we were like pigs, this would be fine, but come on. We human beings are capable of dignity, capable of the appreciation of beauty, capable of truth, capable of things that are far more important than just pleasure and pain. Yeah.
So how do you account for like the desensitization of like the pleasure and the pain? Say like you really love Chick-fil-A and the first time it gives you maximum pleasure, but then the second time it's supposed to give you maximum pleasure, but it doesn't because you've already had it. Like you eat it so much every day that you become desensitized to that pleasure. Same thing with pain. You know, you start to get used to certain pains, so they're not the same level of pain. So how do you account for that?
Good. You're absolutely right. Some pleasures are more sustainable than others. Some pains sustain more than others. And so, actually, before we even get to the details of the moral calculus, we need to think about an individual pleasure or pain and how we measure that. So, Bentham says, I've got the answer to your question. Okay? We look at several different dimensions. First of all, we look at its intensity. How intense is the pleasure? Some pleasures are a lot more intense than others. Some pains are a lot more intense than others, right? You're at the dentist. They're drilling your tooth, and it's a little painful. And they says, I apologize for this next part. Okay, that's more intense pain. So that's one thing we have to care about, intensity of pleasure and pain. Second thing is how long it lasts, right? It's one thing to say, all right, this is gonna hurt. Let's say the doctor gives you a shot. And another to say, this is gonna hurt and keep hurting. I don't remember now which vaccine it was, but I had a vaccine as a kid that it wasn't just the initial needle, it just burned. Whatever it was, just kept burning for quite a while. That was a lot worse than the average shot. And so it's partly intensity, it's partly duration. How long does this last? But now, those aren't the only things that matter. You've got your finger on something that really counts because, after all, some pleasures kind of fade away. Others continue, and so on. So there's several additional dimensions we have to worry about. Now, one of them, he says, is just how close this is. Okay, suppose I say, I'll pay you $10 right now, or I'll pay you $10 tomorrow. Which would you choose? Now, right? Suppose I say, I'll pay you $10 now, or $10 a year from now. Clearly, yeah, a year from now or 10 years from now. You're gonna choose the closer, right? And so, what he calls propinquity, or remoteness. How close it is. We prefer a pleasure that's present to one future. And other things being equal, we prefer a pain to be far away. If you say, look, yeah, this tooth is going to have to be drilled eventually, but you might have 5 or 10 years. That's a lot better than saying, yeah, we better do it right now, isn't it? At least in general. Now, if it induces a lot of fear, there's an episode of, what show is it? How I Met Your Mother? Where the guy says, I'm going to give you a slap sometime you least expect it, okay? And so he's worried constantly until he gets this slap. You might say, yeah, that worry is worse, okay? So remoteness isn't always better. But nevertheless, you could say, yeah, this is a factor we have to think about. We also have to think about some other factors. We have to think about, well, the certainty. It's worse to have somebody say, this will hurt, than to say, hey, it might hurt, right? The more certain that is, the worse it is. Also, we think about its fecundity and its purity. Now, what this means, fecundity is how likely it is to be followed up by additional things of the same kind. So some pleasures continue and are more likely to be continued by pleasures of the same kind. Others you kind of get used to the pleasure and it goes away. You know, that first lick of an ice cream cone on a hot day can be wonderful. But then by the time you get to the end, you're used to the taste, and the last bite isn't nearly as satisfying as the first, you might think. Purity is how likely it is to be followed by pain. Drinking the tequila is lots of fun, okay? But later, you might think, oh, why did I do that, okay? That's a pleasure that's followed by pain in many cases. So, and purity can also be thought of in this way. How mixed is it? A lot of our sensations are mixed between pleasure and pain. And here, I don't mean to go all 50 shades of Bentham on you, but, you know, just think about stepping into a hot shower. It's like, ooh, it feels best when it's just kind of on the edge of being too hot. Or stepping into a hot tub that's just the right temperature. It kind of tingles and it's pleasurable. If it's just lukewarm, that's not particularly pleasurable. If it's too hot, it's not pleasurable. It's got to be just kind of on the edge where it's pleasurable but just a little bit painful. Anyway, those things we have to think about. So all of this has to be taken into account, and then we think how many people this applies to. Now notice when we're thinking about all of this, some of these things, like how long it lasts, and how likely it is, how far away it is, some of those we can judge pretty well for ourselves or for others. But intensity, that's pretty tough, isn't it? So think about your own intensity of pain. You kind of know if this pain is getting worse or getting better. But do you know if your headache today is better or worse than the headache you had last week? I don't know. Or you're working out in the gym. Is the burn in the muscle the same as last week? Or is it a little more intense or a little... I mean, sometimes it's obvious, but sometimes it's like, I don't know. Now, what about different people? How do I judge how much pain or pleasure you're experiencing? And how do I put that on a scale? So we not only have this problem of transparency, we have the problem that economists refer to as the problem of interpersonal comparison. How on earth do I compare my pleasures and pains to your pleasures and pains? After all, it's hard enough for me to judge how much pleasure I'm experiencing now. To tell how much you are, that's really hard. In hospitals, they have ways of trying to do this. A patient comes in complaining about pain, and they'll say, rate your pain on a scale from 0 to 10. 0, no pain at all. 10, you're in agony. Okay, where is your pain? And this is actually, I mean, studies have been done on this. It's actually more reliable than you might think, in the sense that people agree about this more than you might think. Well, at least insofar as we can tell, but you might think, well, how do we know? Because I can't feel your pains to tell how intense they are. And, you know, some people are going to rate this very differently on a scale from other people. So how do we really tell how much pain you're experiencing or how much pleasure? Now, sometimes we can tell if we take a proxy. So economists love this theory, partly because they say, well, I don't know anything about pleasures and pains, but I know about dollars and cents. And I can tell whether this is costing you money or whether it's benefiting you financially. Ah, now I've got something I can calculate and compare. But of course, people care differently about money, so that's very indirectly related to pleasures and pains and happiness itself. So that's a problem. Are there other issues we're going to confront in thinking about how to think about pleasures and pains? Yeah.
I guess I kind of got a question about like how can we even scale it? Like, for example, how do we know what max pleasure feels like or like max pain feels like? Like I've never been bitten by a bullet ant or like jumped out of an airplane. Is there like a threshold should we pass?
Well, that's a good question. In the hospital, they will show people little pictures sometimes. So, you know, 0, 10, this type of thing, 5. You know, to try to give you, all right, which face is like what you're feeling right now. But you're right. If we think, for one thing, does this even have a maximum? I mean, is there such a thing as the maximum pleasure you could possibly feel? The maximum pain? I don't know. Suppose we're torturing you, trying to give you the maximum pain. And then somebody comes in and says, oh, here, put this lighter on his toes in addition. Doesn't that make it worse? I don't know. And I mean, why am I focusing on the pain one? The pleasure one, I don't know what that's going to look like, but is there really a maximum? I mean, maybe there is, but maybe there's not. Maybe you're there in heaven in the presence of God, And there's one more angel who comes in and sings. Oh, it's even better. I don't know. So it's hard to say, right, whether there's really an endpoint on either side or what that would be like. Yeah.
Isn't there like a problem with framing here? Because like seeing pictures could like affect your answer because of that, or like you hear like if it's like 100,000 students, it's like 750, that could like affect your thought of like what you should say.
Well, that's true. Just seeing those pictures might change your impression. Or having you, as in that discussion with my student, sometimes just thinking about it makes it seem worse. You know, I wasn't feeling too bad until you asked me how I'm feeling, and now I'm thinking, oh, well, actually, now that you mention it. And so, yeah, I mean, just the act of reflecting on this can affect the way you feel, and then trying to put it into some numbers. I mean, here's what I think Bentham's really thinking about. That ideally, all of this can be understood in terms of neurophysiology. There are certain things happening in your brain that correspond to pleasure, and other things happening in your brain that correspond to pain. And if we only understood enough neurophysiology, we could measure that. Maybe we could even set it up so there's a little thing on your belt, the pleasurometer. And maybe it transmits by Wi-Fi information about your states, okay, to some central computer. And so we could have an index of the happiness level in the United States right now. Okay, and you're one of the things feeding into that, and we can tell about the neurophysiology. I think that's the way he's in the end thinking about it. In the end, we could find some neurophysiological correlate and measure that. How intense are those neural interactions? I think that's really the picture he has underlying this. But that's obviously really not at all transparent to us. So, and even if somebody proposed such a way of doing it, you might think, well, gosh, I'm looking at my meter, and it says I'm really happy right now, but I don't feel that happy. So you go like, why should I trust this thing to be getting it right? Yeah.
This is a throwback to stuff we talked about several classes ago, but can't there be pleasure that's just bad and pain that's good? Like the evil goes, I feel so great, I served the world, and then pain, the pain of just giving your life to save a bunch of people.
All right, good. Yes, at a certain point, Mill, in fact, says, you know, yeah, pleasure is good. Well, almost all pleasure is good. Okay, and you might think, wait, I thought pleasure and the absence of pain were the definition of happiness and the definition of the good. And he said, well, you know, what about the pleasure you take at the suffering of others? Now, that seems like a bad thing. So there is something utilitarians have to confront. Is there such a thing as a bad pleasure or a good pain? There's a German term for pleasure at the suffering of others, Schadenfreude. And, you know, sometimes it feels like, look, if they are suffering unjustly, it's not really that you're taking pleasure in their suffering, you're taking pleasure in justice or something. But sometimes it isn't like that at all. The comedian slips on a banana and falls down. You go, ha ha! You're taking pleasure in that guy's suffering, right? Or, actually, a lot of comedy depends on this. Something bad happens to somebody in the show, and you laugh. You think, that's funny. And, you know, in real life, maybe you wouldn't. I don't know what would happen if suddenly I slipped on a banana peel and fell in front of you. But I guess, look, he's laughing. He just has a thought. So probably a lot of you would laugh. And it's not because you think, aha, justice. But is that a pleasure? Like, here's a way of let's just put banana peels everywhere. So people are constantly slipping and sliding and falling. It'll be very funny. And it'll make us all happier. You might think, no, right? We don't want to count that pleasure. But if we don't count that pleasure, then wait a minute. What becomes of this whole theory? Now we're introducing something other than pleasure and pain into making this decision. Yeah,
I
Matthew.
don't think that like pleasure and like happiness are equatable exactly. Like for example, if I had like a friend who is just, so happiness is just like serotonin and dopamine. If they're just like in their room, just like on Prozac and smoking pot all day, like maybe they'll have higher serotonin and dopamine, but that wouldn't necessarily make them happy. I would just be like, wow, that guy's really sad. Like that's a depressing.
Excellent. There is a criticism of Robert Nozick. It's called the experience machine. In fact, here they're telling us we need to include experiential learning in the degree. And I keep thinking, what's experiential learning in philosophy? Well, one answer is just living day to day. It's like, yeah, my students are alive. They're doing it right now. But I said something about this on Facebook, and somebody said, install Nozick's experience machine in the philosophy department. And anyway, here's what the experience machine is. You get to program into the machine whatever you want in your life, okay? And then you get hooked up neurally to this machine, and it will give you that life. That is to say, you will experience that life. Now, in fact, you're not going to be really doing anything. So we have to essentially put you in a hospital setting, hook you up intravenously, and so on. You will not really be conscious of the world around you. You will think you're living this life. But you could say, well, okay, yeah, tell the machine, I want to become a great philosopher and a rock star and like a movie star. And then I want to become president of the United States and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, we'll arrange it for you, right? So there you are in this hospital bed, withering away because your muscles aren't doing anything. But nevertheless, you're like, awesome. Now, is that a good life? I mean, all right, some of you think so. Like, yeah, sign me up. I'll be the first one in the machine. But most people are going to look at that and say, oh, that's horrible, right? That's pathetic. What Nozick is driving at is, look, this can't be a matter of just your internal subjective experiences. It's got to be more than that. If those experiences are wildly out of touch with reality, we're not going to judge that to be a happy, good life. If you want something less wild than the experience machine, imagine the guy in the mental hospital who thinks he's Napoleon. There he is. He thinks, I'm in charge of France, you know. Yes, by all means, bring me my dinner, etc. And he's convinced he's Napoleon. He's convinced he's commanding armies. In fact, the nurses are just nodding. And, you know, some of them actually put on a little military jacket when they walk in to sort of feed his delusion or whatever. But the rest of us wouldn't say, oh, man, I want to be that guy. I want to be in the mental hospital so happy because I'm Napoleon. Before Waterloo, I've got to say. In any event, yeah, it's like, wait, no, something matters other than this pleasure and pain stuff, like reality matters in some way. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking, because I didn't think it's possible for there to be a bad pleasure. Because for me, pleasure is very a personal thing. Like some people enjoy pain, like masochists, and people who like the pain, like sex type stuff, you know, like
Right.
like a dominatrix.
Ooh.
Well, something like that.
Well, all right, yeah, a masochist might enjoy pain. It's going to be hard to understand that here,
So
right?
are they going off of the majority view? Like, what's the majority of what people enjoy as a pleasure? Because
Yeah.
some pleasures for certain people are like completely opposite of what like 90% of people are going to agree with. You know?
Good. So this jumps us to Mill's discussion of the qualities of pleasures. Mill says, and actually I think your point is somewhat deeper than this, but I'll come back to the aspect this isn't catching. Mill is worried about this complaint that utilitarianism is a philosophy fit for swine. And so in the 1830s, when he's corresponding with Carlyle, he basically says, well, here's why virtue and other things really matter. Even if they're not enjoyable to you, they produce pleasure for the people around you. Your courage may actually lead you to suffer, but other people will benefit from your virtue. And so he says, yeah, it may not benefit you to become a virtuous person, but it will benefit everyone else. And what matters here is not just your pleasure and pain, but the pleasure and pain of the entire community, everybody affected. Now, by the time he's writing utilitarianism, he still says, well, that's true. All of that's still right. But there's an additional factor. There are different kinds of pleasures and pains, different qualities. Now, Bentham was aware of this. He writes a whole chapter on the different kinds of pleasures and pains, and he has 14 different categories of pleasures, and I think 9 categories of pain. And he elaborates all these into subcategories. But now, Mill says, well, look, it's not just there are lots of different kinds. Some of them are better than others. Some pleasures are better than others in the sense of being more intense or lasting longer or being more likely to be followed by other pleasures, yes, but some are just intrinsically better than others. And how do you tell? He says, you ask the competent judges. You ask the people who are acquainted with both kinds of pleasure. So he thinks you're going to get something like the following categorization. you will get intellectual pleasures, being the best of all. And then social pleasures from human interaction, below those. And then merely sensual pleasures. And that people who know both sides are going to choose certain kinds of pleasure over others. So a kind of pleasure that would involve pain is not only sensual, it's also, he would think, at the bottom of this, highly impure, right? Because you're feeling pain as well as whatever pleasure. So it's even crappy for a sensual pleasure, he would say. But in the end, how do we really tell? Well, we just look at the competent judges and see what they think. And you might, now, in saying that, he is differing significantly from Bentham, not in thinking that some are better than others, but thinking you can make a general judgment about it. Bentham, in his notes that were only published later, says, well, of course, quality as well as quantity has to be taken into account. But it's an individual thing. It depends on the particular person. So, do you enjoy baseball or the opera more? Well, one person might prefer baseball, one person might prefer the opera. And there's no general answer according to Bentham. Whereas Mill says, yes, there is. Survey the competent judges, those who know both baseball and opera, and see which they prefer. Yeah, now, what are you going to get if you actually, I mean, I don't know how big the set of people is who enjoy both baseball and opera, but let's assume it's a fairly small set. And we survey them and say, okay, tickets tonight to the Yankees game or to the Metropolitan Opera. Which do you choose?
Yeah, with opera and what are they playing?
Oh, who are they playing? What, yeah, and how good are the seats? And, you know, blah, blah, blah. I mean, yeah, right. So, so first of all, you might think, wait, I don't know if we can come to any general judgments about this. B, it seems to me in a lot of cases, the competent judges are going to say, I don't know, it depends on all this other stuff, right? How many, I mean, one way, how many baseball games have I been seeing lately? How many operas? You might be like, yeah, I haven't been to Yankee Stadium in a long time, but I've been to the opera a lot. Or maybe you say, wow, yeah, I see almost every baseball game on TV or in person, but I've never been to the opera. Well, competent judges, sorry. I've been to the opera, but only occasionally. So yeah, this is a rare chance to go to the opera. Might depend on how expensive the seats are. It's like, oh yeah, normally I have to pay $200 to get into the opera. And baseball seats I can get for cheaper than that. Although, I don't know if that's any more true. When I used to go to pirate games, I could get in with a student ID for $1. That was awesome. But I don't think that's true anymore. Anyway, you could think all this other stuff is going to get in the way. Well, here's a little test. You're university students. You're well acquainted with intellectual pleasures, with social pleasures, with sensual pleasures. So now, I pose you the following question. Suppose I say the person who has the highest average in the class by the end will get an all-expenses-paid weekend anywhere in the world they want to enjoy their knowledge of organizational ethics. Except there are constraints. You can choose package A, where you will enjoy sensual pleasures. You can go with whoever you want, and if they're not willing, we'll drug them and make them forget later. But whatever, you can go anywhere in the world you want, and you can do whatever you want, but you've got to devote yourself to sensual pleasures. B, we're going to take your best friends, okay, and bring them together for this weekend wherever you like. C, you can get an all-expense-paid weekend in the Perry Castaneda Library, one of the greatest libraries in the United States. Now, which do you choose? Well, yeah, we got to imagine. So, you know, you're going to, in the sensual weekend, you're not going to really get, I mean, you won't see other friends, and you're not going to think any deep intellectual thoughts. And
Yeah, social, yeah, some of your friends just have way girlfriends.
yeah, let's assume these are ones where there's no,
Just saying, like, things would probably happen if you're on an island with alcohol.
wait, well, I don't know. You people must have some more interesting friendships than I have. I mean, if things get wild among my friends, that tends to mean, oh gosh, let's have one more beer, where that tends to not be all that many. But anyway, go ahead.
Are you actually going, or is this just a trip that you experienced?
No, we're actually going. But that is a good question. What if now, here's one way of looking at this. I think if Mill were faced with the results, that wait a minute, most people would choose this one, and very few would choose this. How can he explain that? Well, one way he tries to explain it is to say, look, a lot of people either don't have the ability to appreciate higher pleasures or they lose that ability. I think a second possible answer would be to say, and here borrowing a thought from Plato about the balance of the soul, you really have to have a balance of these pleasures. And so the person deprived of sensual pleasures and force-fed intellectual pleasures, like a college student, I mean, you're kind of like a goose, right, being fattened for foie gras. And here we professors are saying, open up, knowledge. Now spit a little of it back to make sure it's being digested, okay. Okay, you might think, yeah, I'm tired of this, enough of this, I want some more of that. It might look very different if you had been spending the last 10 years in a brothel. And finally you say, okay, you can have more of that or you can go to a lecture by somebody awesome. Okay, the lecture sounds pretty good, right? Another possible response is to say, look, you're cheating. That sensual pleasure weekend is a lot higher on the sensual scale than that weekend in the PCL is on the intellectual scale. So suppose I replace that option with the following option. You will have a mind meld with the mind of God, okay? So for that entire weekend, you will have every thought you want to, anything you want to think, you'll be able to think. Any bit of knowledge you want, any bit of wisdom you want, you will have access to. Okay, so for that one weekend, you'll be completely enlightened, and you'll be, in effect, omniscient, as far, at any rate, as a finite brain can manage. Now which will you choose? Then the intellectual sounds a lot better, doesn't it? In other words, just a weekend, look, I love a day in the library, don't get me wrong. I'd sign up for that one. But, look, most people wouldn't. But you might say, well, it's because it's not really a fair comparison. That's not near the top. All right, well, we're out of time. But we have to think now about all of this stuff for everyone, not just an individual person. So next week, we'll start thinking about some of the problems that arise when we try to really do that. We'll begin looking at game theory and situations that make it pretty hard to actually produce happiness for everyone.